Yeah, my mother and my grandmother, it's a matriarchy on that side of the family, and they come from Upper East Side New York and North Shore Long Island, and very much Oat Wasp, country club and golf playing and tennis and cotillions and that sort of thing. And I would arrive this kind of foreign transplant, this Brit in the summer, always halfway through the summer, obviously, awkwardly, because the British schools get out at a different time, much later than American schools. So I would arrive halfway through and be sort of deposited at sports group, unable to play tennis, related to half the people, but not really in with the group. And certainly that milieu, this sort of strange ethnic enclave of Waspland in North Shore, Long Island, with its, in those days, in the 70s and 80s, everybody, the men wore green trousers and the women wore lily pulitzers and headbands. And it was all quite sort of, literal and alien and sort of funny and absurd to me. So very much drew on that for the setting of Margot.
And what about the differences? Like if you come to Long Island for the summer and you're suddenly in this milieu, how different was it from where you lived and the people you were surrounded with in England?
Well, I mean, it different culturally, different music, different stuff. I mean, it's not that it was impossibly different or alien. It was just more that it was alienating, and that's just the function of being a kid who's gone from one group or one place to another that wasn't particularly welcoming, that wasn't particularly easy, wasn't very accessible to me. I wasn't very good at playing tennis. I remember my grandmother said to me, rather sort of horrified as I refused to take another set of tennis lessons or something, she said, well, I don't know, what are you going to do in life, if there's no tennis? Because there was this sort of idea that you chose one, golf or tennis, and that's what you did. And that was your thing in your spare time or on weekends or holidays or whatever. And the idea that I was sort of had refused both of them, although I liked swimming a lot, but was kind of awkward and difficult. I just didn't fit in very well. So that was, a formative thing, but not a very, I think most people experience that as a child, of being in a place where you feel awkward and other and strange and a bit friendless. And I think I think you can read a lot of that into Margot, even though she grows up in the place, she always feels a little bit apart from it or trying to fit in. Like many societies, it's a sort of quite cliquey, quite enclosed, quite rarefied. The number of families and the stratifications and stuff are quite sharply delineated. And so if you don't, it's like being at school. If you don't fall in with the cool kids, you feel it, particularly at those sort of awkward ages of kind of 10, 11, 12, before you found your own interests or set of friends or feet. So there was a lot of me in Margot and her feeling with her nose pressed against the window. When am I going to say the right thing or be let in or sit with the cool kids at the right table for lunch and that kind of thing. A lot of that came from those summers when I was sitting in the corner, not playing the right game. But I was at first, you want to join in, and then you become, I became a bit of the refusenick, and I became kind of grumpy, or as my dad would have called it, bullshit about it. And I remember when I was about 13 being entirely pretentious and ridiculous, reading the Communist Party manifesto by the side of the swimming pool at the country club, and being totally entranced by the idea that all people could be equal and all workers should unite, and it seemed so elementally obvious to me. And my father, with his tongue very firmly in his cheek, having to upbraid me and say, Wendy, it's really not very polite. Your grandmother is quite upset. Could you put it away? But I think he was secretly rather proud, that that this was my kind of, minor rebellion.
So I'm always interested when I'm talking to writers to know about the point of origin, if there is one, for their work? And obviously, we're talking about your childhood experiences that you drew on in order to draw Margot. But I'm wondering how the book originated for you, if you can point to it. Like, was it this character? Sometimes it's a name, sometimes it's a title, sometimes it's a first line. Was there something that you experienced that got you started?
Well, it's a coming of age story. It's set in the 60s. And so as much as it's personal to it, it's very personal to me in many ways. And there's a lot of me in Margot. It's superficially more about my mother and my mother's generation, who grew up, who were born in the 40s and grew up in the 50s and 60s in a time when the assumptions about what you were going to be as a woman and who you were going to marry and the kind of life you were going to lead were very circumscribed, were very prescribed, were very specific. You know, my mother had a coming out ball. She wore white gloves to it. There were all sorts of strictures and mores about what you wore and where you would go and who you could go with and how you had to be chaperoned. And she got married, like most people in that pre-pill, pre-sex before marriage generation, you know, when she was 19. And all of her contemporaries, including her and her sister, you know, were divorced. It's the 60s changed everything for that generation of women. You could have sex where you couldn't before because the idea of pregnancy was completely horrific outside of marriage. And simultaneously, at some point, they changed the divorce laws in New York State and elsewhere in the US. And so you didn't have to go to Mexico or you didn't have to go out of the country to get a divorce anymore. And that became more of a reality. So it was this decade that always fascinated me because because I saw the impact it had on my mother and her generation, but also just the speed of social change. And expectations seem to me to be extraordinary. You know, there's that idea that JFK, when in his swearing in, was bareheaded, and suddenly the next day everybody took off their hats. Right? You look at photographs of crowds of people on either side of the Atlantic, in New York or in London or anywhere really, in the 40s and 50s and in the first part of the 20th century, and everybody is wearing a hat. You just wore a hat and gloves when you left the house. And suddenly everybody took off their hats. I always thought this moment was this sort of, how did that happen? When did everybody decide that that was going to be a sort of liberal, was it even a conscious liberal decision? I don't know, but it seemed to be emblematic of the way and the speed that things shifted in that generation. That seemed really fascinating to me and interesting to follow somebody, to follow a woman, to follow a girl trying to grow up in that and navigate that, the assumptions of where she'd come from, particularly putting Margot in the milieu that I knew well, this very upper class, very baroque, rather absurd and pompous and staid and stiff and sometimes quite, I mean, sort of amusingly so, funny in many ways, society, and putting her in the middle of a decade full of upheaval and violence and change and riot and revolution, and seeing what she could make of it.
So, in addition to this being a coming of age story, this is also very much to me a mother-daughter story. And the mother character in this book, Margot's mother, Peggy Vanderloop Thornton, if I'm pronouncing that correctly,
Yeah.
is she's quite a character, like a very domineering, very unhappy woman who I think doesn't really understand why she's unhappy.
No, I think that, you know, in some ways I kind of drew on my grandmother a little bit for this, not entirely, because you start in one place or you start with an idea or a shape of a character and then they turn into their own people as you're writing them. But my grandmother was really smart, really intelligent, entirely uneducated, very capable, really organized, and, you know, never had the chance to have a job, be out in the world, and I think was sort of frustrated in a way by that and limited in a way, but also very much in control of her house and her world and her family. So I think that it sort of describes, yeah, it's a different, mothers and daughters are often difficult. And that was fun to grapple with and interesting to grapple with. But also the sort of, I think that Peggy is a woman who's trying to be in control because of her house and her family, because she's not able to be in control in the real world, in the outside world, in the world that's dominated and controlled in her case, and for many women like that, by the people that you marry or the fathers that you have. You're subject to the circumstances of your birth and the circumstances of your marriage more than your own volition and what you can do about it. And I think as the novel progresses and fortunes change for her, she can't adapt. And that's, I think, hopefully sad, tragic, pitiable, that she got stuck. She got stuck in a situation that she couldn't adapt out of.
Yeah, she's a tragic figure. And I think, you talk about Margot being this smart, awkward young person who, as an accident of fate, really is born into this time of great social upheaval and change. And getting to watch her experience that is very interesting. It's equally interesting and maybe even a little bit more poignant to watch her mother experience this, because there's so much fear. And I think it's like you say, it's earned fear. The time that she was born into and came up in was very much different. And I think she can't help but project a lot of those fears and concerns that she was raised with onto her daughter. And I guess it's a classic tale, right? This generational struggle and the differences between the generations and the difficulties that they have trying to understand one another.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a classic tale. I think that in Peggy's case, it's scary to her. It's threatening to her. The world suddenly became cold and unhospitable when she had been, had an assumed place in it, had a presumption of prestige, had a presumption of privilege that she hadn't even bothered to question. And when she's invited to question it or invited to look at it another way or forced to, she can't. And so there's this desperation of trying to cling on to appearances. And that's just tragic, but also very human. The superficial trappings of status, the things you think that matter that people cling on to. I think that's ageless. And I think the yearnings of a young woman who's, her daughter, who's unsure of herself, very unsure of herself, clearly doesn't want to follow in her mother's footsteps, but doesn't have a very good idea of her own path. And I think I remember that a lot from my own late adolescence. I also like Margot, got into a good college, and that was great. And I'd sort of ticked that box. But what I was supposed to be doing with that was not at all clear. And the path was not obvious. And so I think that Margot, in amidst, you see her wavering, being wobbly. She's not, in some ways, in some early versions of the book, she was a bit weedy, and I had to kind of strengthen her a bit and give her a bit of volition. But at the same time, I didn't want to make her too all-knowing, too brilliant. She doesn't come out on top all the time. She's always second guessing herself and hanging back, and is full of sort of regret and worry. And she's a bit of a nervous Nelly. And sometimes I would get a bit frustrated with her, and I'd have to sort of push her forward a bit and give her a riposte and strengthen her spine, a little bit like her mother might have wanted to do in some of the scenes. But it was funny how it was interesting to see her evolve through different versions and different versions of the book, because she kind of grew up as I was writing her. She came into herself as I was writing her. It was a coming of age story, written as a coming of age story also too. That part of it was fun.
I found Margot to be an incredibly winning character, and I thought drawn in a way that felt very believable and true to life. Sometimes I can get frustrated with young ingenue characters who are just too smart for their age. This happens a lot, I feel like, in fiction, where especially when there's a younger protagonist who is in some way a proxy for the author. It may be tempting as a writer to project too much of the wisdom that you might have accrued as you've, grown up, and then put it onto the protagonist. But you do a nice job of giving her that insecurity and maybe the lack of knowledge and worldliness that any person her age is most likely to have.
Yeah, no, she doesn't get it a lot of the time, and she's scared of it too. And she's kind of good at school, but that worries her as well, and she's scared of the next step. What's beyond the textbook, what's all the stuff, what's the university of life stuff, the stuff that you're supposed to know or should be innate or intuitive. That stuff she's not good at all. And she also understands, as a scientist, or as somebody who wants to be a scientist with those kind of ambitions, that you need to be able to imagine beyond the border on the map. You need to be able to push through that. And she's very hesitant. It doesn't come easily to her. She would rather have, a table of figures to learn and down pat and to recite than to try to form her own logic or theory. And that's also, I think, a function of a sort of rather crabbed education, which I think is also fairly universal. We're all pretty much put through a certain sort of mill of exams and rote and essays and tasks to complete and boxes to tick. And so when she finds herself needing the extra tools, the tools of imagination and of courage and of independence too, she's not great at it. She finds herself struggling with that, which I think a lot of us do. I mean, I very much struggled with that at university. I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing, and nobody told me. So I flailed around a lot at university.
Well, I think that flailing around at that age is kind of what you're supposed to be doing. I think there's something a little bit strange to me about anybody who's 17, 18, 19 years old and is really on top of their game.
I know, that's true.
And I feel like, yeah, but at the same time, I feel like, maybe the signals that we're getting at that age, the messages that we're getting from elders and from the culture is that we're supposed to know. And so we feel like we're lacking something because we don't. But goodness, that's like what that time of life is for, is it not?
No, I mean, I completely agree when you look back on it. But at the time, it feels awkward. It feels like you're floating around. It feels like you're sort of, splashing in the shallow end and not getting to the other side of the pool. And I remember feeling, in my early 20s, having graduated and sort of bounced around with a few jobs and finding myself in Tbilisi in Georgia, where I had gone to write stories, absurdly enough. And I remember just having a sort of, one of those, classic existential crises where you're like, I'm nothing, I've achieved nothing, I've done nothing, I'm 26 and I've done nothing, and now it seems completely ridiculous. At the time, it felt very emotionally real, So I think
sure.
that's also part of what I would think I was trying to convey in Margot, is that stuff hurts deeply, when you're that age. You have no perspective by which to judge it. You have, and Margot, poor thing, has no siblings either. So she doesn't have anybody to bounce this stuff off. She's kind of stuck in her own head. And it's hard to have perspective. It's hard to know what's experience and what experiences to take or to accrue. And how to become something when you don't know what that something is.
So, it's interesting to think about the time that she's coming up in again, because as we've said, it's this time of great upheaval and social change. And neither of us lived through this time, but I am and I think you probably are too, based on the fact that you wrote a book about this period, very much a fan of 1960s cultural history. Like that decade is endlessly fascinating to me. And what I find myself wondering as we talk is, clearly that decade is known for being this really dynamic period in history, and a period that was like revolutionary in many senses, and the speed of change was extraordinary. And I'm wondering about my own life and times. Has it been boring by comparison? Is every era marked by revolutionary change? And
I think sometimes history goes fast and sometimes it goes slow. Um, and I remember, in the 90s thinking, oh, well, this is interesting because not much has changed. I remember thinking. And in some ways, people still wore trousers and shirts and suits and watched television and so forth and so forth. And then suddenly the internet arrived and then everything changed. So in some ways, before that, technologically and, life for sort of 30 years or 40 years post-war, I mean, there had been, different music and different trends, and the skirts had gone up and down in length and so forth. But in lots of ways, not. And then recently, a lot of more fundamental changes about where we work, how we work, how we connect, how we're concentrating, how we communicate. That stuff has been lightning in the last 10 or 15 years.
yeah, I feel like definitely that. I mean, at least it seems like since what, the late aughts, it feels like things have picked up. Feels like a lot has happened since, say, 2008, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's also a lot has happened in the technological realm, and technology is about communicating. And I remember, because I covered the Arab Spring for the New Yorker, and I was in Cairo for 2 years in 2011 and 12. And there was a lot of talk at the time that those revolutions were fomented and encouraged by social media and Facebook posts and spread about in that way. And that they had somehow been the Facebook revolutions. But crucially, for the first 5 days, I think, of the Egyptian uprising, they turned the internet off in Egypt. And people went out onto the streets, word of mouth, old-fashioned style, old school. And I sometimes wonder whether, yes, the means has changed, but is the message changing? There's something to do with, the speed of discourse and the speed of dissemination of information and the foment of it. But it's hard to gauge whether it's more or less important than printing, the invention of printing and the dissemination of ideas that engendered. Or I don't remember because I was little, but the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini's, who was in exile at the time, his speeches went viral, as it were, on cassette tapes that were passed around. So in a funny kind of way, I think people always had a way of communicating. There is a welter now that seems to be dizzying. And I do notice that because of the ease and speed and quantity of screen and media, just the quantity of media, that I'm noticing, as I'm sure many people are, that my concentration spans are different. I'm reading less on a page, more on a screen. When I work, my bursts of concentrated work are shorter, more interrupted by spelling bee and things like that. I mean, I always did, Sudoku or, something, but it was on paper, and there was something about the physicality or the tactility of that interruptive exercise that was a bit of a different quality, that seemed to be of a different quality or take up a different time space. But it's hard to know what weight or difference, how we judge the medium and the content, right? What effect is one having and what effect is the other having?
So I want to go back to you as a child, around the same age as Margot growing up. You had mentioned earlier that going to Long Island in the summers, you would feel sort of out of place and everyone would try to foist a golf club or a tennis racket into your hands. And young Margot is much the same. She seems a little bit out of place and a little bit awkward. And she has this keen interest in the sciences. She's a science nerd. And I'm wondering if that squares with you as a young woman.
Not
Were you
remotely
into
science-minded, and I was quite annoyed with Margot for having an interest in science because I had to spend quite a lot of time reading up on it and educating myself about. She's particularly into genetic science and DNA as discovered, and when she's a child, and this is what she's following at university in her studies. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to reading books on DNA, on the discovery of DNA, on epigenetics, on scissoring and CRISPR and how you can rearrange and edit genes and so forth. And it's hard for me. It was difficult for me to wrap my head around it and understand the differences in chemical sequences and what's really going on. And so the other thing that was difficult was having to then kind of rewind the technology and knowledge that we almost take for granted now in that field to the late 60s when it was just beginning and when it was very unintended embryonic. And to sort of rewind the level of knowledge back to a kind of, an early stage where they had a much sketchier idea of what DNA was or how it functioned or what might be possible and so forth. And it was interesting in my peregrinations and falling down rabbit holes on web and looking, typing endlessly DNA sequencing into YouTube or whatever, it's quite hard to find something that visually describes it and that visually illustrates DNA and what is happening. You mostly get these sort of rather cartoon illustrations. And I realized somewhere along the line that there isn't a photograph of DNA, that it's too small to see. And that there isn't really a photograph of an atom because it's too small to see, even now. So we're kind of extrapolating from various other observations and reactions that DNA has on things. So it was a kind of curious exercise in realizing how much we think we know and how much we don't or might not.
So you can't even see DNA under like a really high-powered microscope?
I don't think so. I was not able to find a picture of this. Like, maybe somebody will tell me this is wrong, but they mostly look like, very blown up, sort of illustrative, filled in diagrammatic drawing renderings of it.
Yeah, well, I was very impressed with the passages in the book that dealt with biochemistry and genetics and all the rest. Like, it was very believable to me. And I kept wondering to myself, I was like, wow, this woman is a journalist. She's a novelist. Is she also a geneticist? It was going to be very disappointing to me, or very, what's the word? Infuriating, if that were the case. I'm relieved to know that it was all the product of research.
No, it's just research and make believe. That's the joy of novel writing.
Well done. And I want to talk to you about the revision process that you took this book through, because I couldn't help but notice in the acknowledgement section that you thank your agent, Bill Clegg, who incidentally has guested on this show before, back when he was touring with one of his books. And you thank him for kind of pushing you through multiple revisions, as an agent or an editor often will do with an author on a project. And my question for you is, what you gained from that process? Like, what changed significantly in revisions that made the book what it became?
I mean, he just pushed and pushed and pushed, and it drove me, over the course of, I think, 2 years or more, and it kind of drove me crazy because I kept thinking, okay, is this okay? Is this okay? This is much better. Oh, I've done a lot of work now. And I think, I mean, at first he pushed me to refine it, to bring Margot to the fore, to define her character better, to streamline certain scenes, to, you know, there was definitely large sections of that got chucked, you know, of sort of backstory of the family and various aunts and uncles that weren't needed, and rather baroque incrustations to her, to the Vanderlope family. So a lot of that got tossed by the wayside, which was good. And then it was just, you know, honing and rewriting scenes, certain key scenes between Margot and people over and over again, so that the bones of it got polished up, and the form just got leaner and more polished. And then the last few times, or the last couple of times, I remember it was almost fun, because I went through and just took out, you know, this paragraph isn't working, not this sentence, not this adverb, not this subclause. It was just taking out and taking out and taking out, and just making it lean, making sure that every sentence was doing something instead of, you know, being ornamental, and certainly, you know, getting rid of all those writerly filigreed phrases that you tend to come up with when you're writing, when you're getting lost in something when you're writing. But I think, you know, it's my second novel, and both times I've sat down and sort of started not knowing where I was going to end up. And I think that while that's sort of fun, it's messy. And I think the next one, I'm going to try and have a better idea of what I'm doing and where I'm going. Not necessarily sort of exhaustively plotted out, but just a better idea of the shape of it before I start. Because although it's sort of fun doing it this way, and you certainly discover it a lot, and certainly Margot is the product, her character is a product of a sort of, as I said, a sort of gradual evolution. It was long. It was hard to revisit and go over it again and again with fresh eyes and fresh heart and enthusiasm. You know, you're just like, I think I wrote this already. But it's also an exercise in, there's always room for improvement. There's always another level to take it to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that feeling of frustration that writers can experience when they've put so much time and energy into a project, and they hand it off to an editor or an agent or a trusted reader, thinking like, this thing is done. And there is this strange emotional need or drive in writers, I feel like, to externalize projects and to have them done, like, get it out of me. And then to hand it over and to have someone read it and come back to you and say, no, there's more work to be done. It can elicit a frustrated emotional response.
It's not just not frustration, it hurts. I mean, it physically hurts. It takes like several days to absorb that. It's a very fundamental rejection of your baby. You know, it's not easy, but I mean, the annoying thing is that he was right. I mean, I wouldn't have done it if I had not felt like he was right, or, you know, his comments were acutely apposite and very much in the service of Margot and her characters. And so I just pretty much did what he told me to do. And I was, you know, very lucky to have him guiding me through it, because it's not easy to find a reader who gets it and gets it as well as Bill does, because he's a writer himself. So he knows, you know, what I think he could see what I was trying to do, and the early grapplings and the kind of misshapen clay. He was like, okay, there's a bowl in here somewhere.
Well, that's the thing. It's like this it's like a bookended experience. Like the first bookend is the frustration and the pain of having somebody tell you that it's not right. And then the bookend to that is the gratitude that you feel when it is finally done and done well, to have had somebody who could see what you were trying to do clearly and had the decency to push you, even when they knew that it might piss you off.
No, I mean, very much so. But there is that kind of weird thing that when you're writing a book, particularly if it's a novel, I think you have, I don't know if it's just me, but I mean, I'm fairly convinced that it's the best thing that's ever been written while I'm writing it. You know, I have this,
Right.
you know, this kind of absurd sort of belief that keeps you going, because if you didn't, otherwise you would just be, you know, halting and stuttering constantly through the pages. But the minute it's finished, the minute it's sent to the publisher, then I'm mortified. Then I can barely read it. I can barely look at it. I don't want to see it. I'm just embarrassed. And I have completely the opposite reaction. It's quite funny. And then 2 or 3 times it's happened to me that I've been, you know, several years later, maybe 10 years later, I'm in a friend's house and I see a copy of a book of mine on their bookshelf, and I idly pick it up and I read something that I hadn't even thought about in many years, and I think, oh God, that's not that bad. Huh. How did I know that? When did I know that?
Yeah.
And then I revisit it. But it's a strange thing, because while you're writing, you know, to be in that flow and in that stream, you have to be fairly, you kind of, I don't know, it's a confidence trick on yourself, really, that this is good and keep going, because there's a point to it, or there's a value to it.
It almost feels like something like a biological necessity or something. The only way for writers to endure the process of writing a book is to have those moments of grandiosity where you're thinking to yourself, this is great. It's a masterpiece. I'm writing something brilliant. Because in the absence of that kind of belief, or in the absence of that kind of hope, maybe, how do you possibly sustain yourself through all of the ups and downs and the years that it takes usually to get a novel done?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a ridiculous undertaking. I think, I mean, I wouldn't do it if there was any plan B. I just, you know, I always wanted to write. It was the thing that I liked doing and that I was good at, and there was just never a proper plan B. I should have, you know, I should have taken accountancy or learned how to code, or, you know, I mean, had one of those good backup plans, but I didn't. So it's not, yeah, it's a bit compulsion. It's a bit, you write because you want to record, because you want to say, because you want to tell, and that's the way you express yourself. You're a bit stuck with it if you're a writer. There's not a lot of choice about it. You have to make the best of it.
So in my research leading up to this conversation, I read something about you with respect to your writing, and in particular with respect to your work on your book projects, and how at least in the earlier books, you had to kind of give yourself a mantra in order to get yourself through the project and to make yourself believe maybe that you could. And I think for the book about Georgia, the country, I think the mantra was, you're not wrong. And then there was a book about, in Iraq, a work of nonfiction called The Weight of a Mustard Seed. And I think the mantra there was, you haven't failed yet. And I'm wondering, did you have a mantra with Margot?
Did I have a mantra with Margot? I can't remember. I do remember, though, the first novel I wrote, my mantra for that was, I remember just being like in a sort of fury and frustration with journalism. I remember thinking, okay, I'm just going to write a novel. I'm just going to sit down. I'm going to write 10,000 words a week until it's done. And my mantra for that one was, walk into any bookshop. How many crappy, mediocre novels are there in here? Is there any reason yours can't be one of them? I remember thinking, I was like, just lose this Tolstoy complex and get over yourself and just write something. And Margot, what was it? I don't know. I think it was like, it's not over yet. It's not done yet. Sort of keep going. It's not done yet.
Okay.
Partly the sort of, wanting to be a writer, wanting to have a career doing that, wanting to have a certain success at it. It's the fat lady has not sung yet. You're still on the road. It's still part of the process. Keep going. And it's a bit like life. You think you think you're going to get somewhere. You think that there is a summit to achieve, but it's all uphill. It's the journey. It's just the uphill. There isn't a summit. There isn't the other side.
Right.
You just sort of, it's not done yet. Keep writing.
So you mentioned that you always wanted to be a writer and that you didn't have a plan B, which sounds familiar to me. And I've heard that from many people on this show before. You went off to college. I believe you studied at Cambridge University. Is that right?
I did, yeah.
And what did you study? Were you studying literature there?
No, I studied history at Peterhouse College, which was the smallest and oldest college at Cambridge. I was not a great student. I was a bit lost. I found the curriculum rather narrow and the way of teaching rather lonely, because they don't teach in classes as they do in American universities. At Oxbridge, they teach in one-on-one tutorials. And I made some friends, and it was fine, but I didn't, particularly excel or find my feet, and left pretty much. I left in 1992. I remember, in the middle of a recession, with no discernible marketable skill. I could not use a computer. I'd never used a computer. I could not speak another language. I was no use to anybody. So I went to New York. That was my... I followed a boyfriend to New York.
Okay, so you followed a guy there, and then what did you do when you were in New York?
I think I got one of those sort of funny jobs, working on a magazine that dealt with investment in Eastern Europe. And I did that for a while, and I went to Moscow for them, and then I ended up working as a receptionist at a literary agent where I met Bill Clegg. And then I ended up fact-checking for Time magazine. And then they moved me to London, so I had a real job working for Time magazine in my late 20s in London.
As a reporter?
Yeah, and I started off as assistant to the editor, and I made sure that I was not a very good assistant to the editor, and luckily he was a very nice guy, and so he quickly promoted me. Not promoted, I mean, I didn't get any more money, but he sort of threw assignments at me. So write this book review, or rewrite this story, or and he sent me a couple of places. I think I went to Moscow to report on nightclubs. This was in 1997, when Moscow was an up and coming, exciting capital. And then I was there for 2 years, and then I thought, I wanted to travel. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I wanted to be out in the world. I didn't want to be in the office. And so I sort of left on a big punt, and I said, I'm going to go and live in Tbilisi in Georgia. And my editor said, well, that's nice, Wendy. Do you think you'll be back at all? And I said, I don't think so. And I wasn't. And I have not been gainfully employed really since.
Okay, so wait, I want to ask you, Tbilisi, like, what drew you there? Why there, of all places?
Of all places, I think that I was the generation that, grew up in the Cold War. The Berlin Wall came down when I was 19. It was amazing. It was the end of history. It was a seminal moment. And I looked across that great divide and thought, what is going on the other side? Who are those people? What are they doing? That just seems incredibly fascinating and interesting to me. And I had been in Moscow a few times, but Moscow seemed scary to me because it was big and a big city and quite cold in the winter and full of proper journalists. And I felt a bit more kind of wobbly weevely. And so I thought, I might just go to the Caucasus, which I had read about in Fitzroy MacLean and Arthur Koestler and other heroes of mine who traveled in the Soviet Union in the 30s. I might just go south. It seemed to me to be a sort of smaller place where a smaller pond to splash around in. So I visited Tbilisi first for about 10 days, summer of 1998. It was a sort of flatline economy, no, almost no electricity. Nothing was happening. The wars, it had a couple of nasty separatist wars, and those had ceased. And so it was kind of quiet, but I mean, dead quiet. All the hotels were full of refugees from Abkhazia. And I remember staying at a guest house that was being run by this inimitable and legendary figure called Betsy Haskell, an American woman. And she said, "Oh, Wendy, well, very, nice to meet you. What are you doing in Tbilisi?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I think I'm a tourist." And she said, "Oh, a tourist. Yes." She said, "We had one of those last year," she said. So I sort of fell in with the right crowd. I went back. I moved there. It was a cheap place. It was very cheap to live there. I bought a old Neva Lada 4x4 and drove around the Caucasus and had lots of adventures and got lots of stories and wrote my first book.
Okay. And were you working as a journalist? Were you filing stories for anyone during that time?
I was occasionally. I did. I was still writing for Time magazine, and I did a few things for them, but not much. I was mostly. It was this rather indulgent but wonderful time just to read and think and listen and learn a bit of Russian and try and understand what writing was. And I remember trying to write short stories, and it took me fully a year to kind of undo the Time magazine style that I'd been writing and to find a bit of a voice. It took longer than I thought, and it was one of those lessons. I could write a book and finish it and do it, and that was a sort of extraordinary thing to me. But also that it took a bit of time, that it wasn't something that you could do in 6 months, that it took a little bit of time to get the voice right, and quite a lot of false starts and shards and bits of stories that didn't go anywhere, and, sitting in the laptop.
So you've since gone on to live and work all over the world, in particular in the Middle East. You've done a lot of journalism work on the ground in dangerous places: Syria, Afghanistan, Lebanon, often at times of conflict, war. You were in Tahrir Square in Egypt during the Arab Spring, correct?
I was, yeah. It was extraordinary. It was such an extraordinary time. It was thrilling. It was a great privilege to be there.
And you just packed up and went as soon as you started to get the sense that things were going to turn? Like, how did you wind up there at that time on those days?
On those days, I was in Jerusalem at the time. I'd gone there for 2 or 3 months just to sort of hang out. I had some friends there, and I thought I wanted I'd never been in Jerusalem, and I wanted just to sort of see what was what. And things started happening, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt. And I just got that, the thumpy feeling in my chest, that kind of, I want to be there. I desperately want to be there. And I didn't know how to get there or who would send me. And I remember I emailed 3 editors. I'm right next door. I've reported from Egypt before. I want to go. Please send me. And I had a dinner party, people came over for dinner in Jerusalem, and I washed up after they left, and I opened my laptop to read my emails. It was 1 a.m, and nobody had replied except for David Remnick at the New Yorker. And there was just 2 words: yes, go. And I was on a plane at 6 o'clock the next morning to get a connecting flight through Amman to Cairo airport that was not yet open, or that was supposedly shut. And so off I flew. So off I flew and landed. It was like, oh my God, now I have to report on this enormous story for this enormous magazine. And then you just take a very, very deep breath and go out and report. I remember Remnick gave me the most good advice. I said, what about this? What about this? Shall I do this? This story? And I was trying to be helpful. And he said, just go and report the hell out of it. Just go report. That was just a very good elemental, just go listen, write down everything. We'll figure it out.
What about just from a logistical perspective on the ground in Egypt at that time? The internet, I think you said, was down for several days right around the time of the revolution or the uprising. So if you're trying to communicate with an editor in the United States, for example, like did that prove difficult? Like was the
It
was
was
the
it
just
was
the nuts and the nuts and bolts part of reporting? Like, can you just talk about how you did it?
Yeah, I remember. I think I arrived on day 4 or 5. The internet was out, and they wanted something immediately for the website, and I wrote down my journey in from the airport, which was kind of interesting because it was through all these. The streets were very dark, and there were checkpoints or barricades at almost every street by locals who were manning them with sort of hunting pistols and swords and billy clubs and burning braziers. And there was smoke hanging over Tahrir, and you could kind of feel, there was very much an atmosphere in the place. And they wanted me to write something about that immediately. I had just arrived, like half an hour later. And I said, I can't file. There's no internet. And I wrote it longhand and dictated it over the phone. So that was, old school. I think we then ended up, if memory serves, they did turn the internet on, or there was patches of it. It was very dodgy for a few days. And we ended up moving hotels because there was another hotel that had internet. I don't know how. Maybe they had a satellite connection. I can't remember. But within a couple of days, we had an internet connection.
So one of the things that you wrote about this period of time in your life and in your career, I believe it might be drawn from Circling the Square, which is the book that you wrote about this experience in Egypt. I'm going to read a line. If I'm mistaken in terms of the source, please forgive me. But you wrote, I began to realize that witnessing something did not give you any good sense of what had really happened. A bearing witness was the most unreliable narrator of all. So I found that really striking because I'm thinking to myself, wow, she was in Tahrir Square. She was body to body with all of these protesters, and she saw it with her own eyes. And yet it is also relatable to me that even when you're right up close to it and it's right in your face, you still aren't seeing it. And maybe you're seeing it less because it's got to be too much to take in.
There's a huge amount to take in, and part of it is you can't see the wood for the trees. Part of it is that you have no perspective because you're at ground zero. And part of it is that, I think I wrote Circling the Square as a sort of an attempt to describe, what it's like when you're trying to understand something that's happening right in front of you and it's hard to see. And it's partly hard to see because you don't know what's happening yet. History doesn't know what it's doing. A crowd doesn't know what it's doing. What is intent? What is accident? What is happenstance? What is circumstance? What is these all sorts of strange and different forces, many of them accidental and haphazard, are exerted in moments like that. And as there were, I think, 9 days of demonstrations until Mubarak resigned. But then there was a year and a half after that until they elected a President Morsi. And then there was another year of continuing instability until Morsi was deposed. And so throughout all that time, it was switchback, what could happen, what forces were going to be on top, who might win, in inverted commas, this situation or this country, or what they called the chair, the presidency. And, you would talk to a bunch of people, not a bunch of people, you talk to everybody you could find, from political commentators to politicians to ex-party members to, to people on the ground, to activists, to leaders, and they didn't know either. And so I think I wrote Circling the Square as a way to describe this fizzy melee that history can be sometimes, where you think you want to be able to comb out the strands of import and weight them appropriately in your analysis. But it's hard to see sometimes. I know that it was very hard to understand for several months after the initial revolution and the deposing of Mubarak, that it was really the army that was the main power in that country. And even for Egyptians, the realization came slower than you might think, that this was the power behind everything, and that what they wanted and what they were going to do was going to determine ultimately what happened. It wasn't clear at the beginning, and I think that was a real lesson as a writer, as a journalist, to try and, you want to impose order on something, you want to understand what you're looking at. And you're sucked in by the romance and excitement often of a revolution. Certainly, we all were. It would have been very difficult. You would have had to have been hard-hearted not to have been swept away in that tumult and excitement of Tahrir. But I see it now because I've spent the last year or so, the last year a lot in Ukraine, and it's very easy and obvious to fall in with be on the Ukrainian side. Of course, we want to be on the Ukrainian side. This is quite an easy one. Good guys against bad guys. The defenders against the aggressors, and so forth. But it's easy to swallow the Ukrainian propaganda and the plucky Ukrainians, and to be sort of swept up by their optimism and their bravery and their fortitude. And I've been out now for the last 6 weeks or 2 months, and the further I am out of it, the more I kind of cock my head and try and look at the situation with a little bit more of perspective, and sit and think, okay, can the Ukrainians really win this? How are they going to manage that? What is the depth and strength of Russia, even though they look like they're clumsy and oafish and violent and not very effective or strategic. So I think that in all circumstances, it's one of those kind of lessons. It's the classic trite observation that the older you get, the more you realize that the less you know, the less you understand, the less you're able to discern some kind of wisdom or perspicacity or perspective, and that these sort of forces, particularly in war and revolution and riot, are very messy and always full of unintended consequences.
I want to ask you about danger, as you mentioned it just now, because I think there have to be listeners who are hearing about your exploits as a journalist and your travels all over the world and the time that you spent in these places that are experiencing war and revolution, about how you manage your own safety. It's dangerous for anyone. I would imagine there are additional safety concerns, being a woman, for example, in Tahrir Square. I know that there was a 60 Minutes journalist who was attacked, I want to say, when she was on the ground there. It's kind of, it's a related point, but the real question is just like, what goes through your mind? How do you manage this? And what precautions do you take to protect yourself?
Well, I'm a fairly scaredy cat, so I'm not in the front line. I try to be, I've always been fairly cautious and sort of, on the back row, not the front row. I'm not a photographer. I don't have to be right up and front in the trenches. I think you just look, there are lots of different circumstances and lots of different situations, and there isn't one size fits all. There are a couple of obvious things. If you're in a riot or a demonstration or a revolution on a square or something, you make sure that you've got an exit route. You don't stand with your back into a corner. You pay attention to the mood of the crowd. You go and come back, and there are certain sort of things that you try and sort of hover off to one side, come in again, go out again. There are various things that you can do that are a little bit more sensible than rushing right into the middle of the fray kind of thing. And in war, everybody has their own their own set of lines and that are and comfort zones, and it's very difficult sometimes it's very difficult to be super intelligent about risk assessment. The Middle East got really difficult to operate in. I remember I was in Baghdad in 2003, 4, 5, and at the end I had to leave because I was a freelancer. I just simply could not afford the kind of security infrastructure that was necessary, because journalists and Westerners were targets. And if you're the target, it's really difficult to defend yourself against that. If you're not the target, for example, I covered the war in Lebanon in 2006 and in Ukraine, for example, then it's simply a matter of not simply, but it's a matter of proximity to the exploding things, and you can make a reasonable decision about that. And in Ukraine, you can make a decision about whether to push forward or whether to pull back. That's the best you can manage, and how far you do either of that is up to you and your story and what you want to do or what you want to achieve or what you think is reasonable in that set of situations. But I mean, it's how to say. You take a risk assessment and you check in with yourself. I was doing this a lot, and the last time I was in Ukraine, I was in Kherson a fair amount, and it's like, okay, is this okay? You check in with yourself and with your team, your translator, your driver, and other people around you. Everybody feeling okay? Does this feel stupid? Do you feel worried? Do you want to stay here for a while? Do you want to bug out? You just have to kind of pay attention to what your senses and your sixth sense is saying. But having said that, you can certainly be unlucky, but you just try and make the best decisions you can at the time.
It's reminding me of a book I read years ago by a guy named Chris Hedges. It's called War as a Force That Gives Us Meaning. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but he worked as a journalist in a lot of places like this, where there was a war going on. And he wrote in a way that sticks with me to this day about how addictive war can be, for journalists. There's a ton of adrenaline involved and such a heightened sense of reality, I would have to imagine, that it's kind of like in that movie, The Hurt Locker, where the soldier comes back from, I want to say, Iraq, and, suddenly he's in like the grocery store looking at cereal. It's just like, what? There's just a huge schism between the two worlds.
It's very exciting and very important, and it feels like this, and it is an extraordinary privilege to be in these places and to be able to see these things and listen to these stories and be with people who are really facing the ultimate of life and death and fear and consequences. And it's there's a lot talked about the addiction of it and the addiction to the adrenaline of it, and I think that's part of it for some people, but it's also there's also just a very sort of rather more ordinary thing that if that's your job and you're a journalist, you want to do a good job. You want to get a good story. You want to do well. You want to report well. You want to be thorough. You want to go to the place that's important or where something has happened. It's not quite as sort of junky, adrenaline fueled rock star, as sometimes it's portrayed. It's really just people whose job it is that you want to, and you want to do a good job. If you're a journalist, it's the way of, there's a lot of professional pride and competitiveness of pitting yourself against your peers and also against yourself, and also, just you want to tell the story, you want to do well, and so when you're driving down that road and there's a bit of bombardment, or you're driving towards something that's a bit more in a frontline area, that's your motivation. Your motivation is not, I want to be adrenaline, this is really exciting. It's like, I want to, that town has just been liberated. What just happened there? I want to know.
You know, I'm thinking now, and forgive me, I don't mean to like psychoanalyze you, but I'm like, you know, she goes out to these places, exposes herself to at least some degree of danger. It's very exciting. And then she comes home to this quiet town in the northwest of France on the coast. It makes sense to me that you would be diving into the ocean in the middle of winter, because you're probably like, I'm so bored, I'm going to go jump in the ocean when it's January.
No, I'm not a war junkie. I'm not a news junkie. It's just, you know, for me, having started my career, I mean, you know, the very first story I ever wrote was from Prague 6 weeks after the Velvet Revolution in 1990. You know, this is like the full circle for me, Ukraine. There is not often that I get that sort of thump in my chest of that I want to be there, I need to be there. But I had it in Tahrir Square because I'd spent so much time in the Arab world, and this seemed like an extraordinary explosion of hope. And I had it when Putin invaded Ukraine. You know, this was just an area, a moment, a piece of history that I just wanted to see. It felt like, you know, this is, it's like, it's as large and as dangerous as the Second War, you know, and is hugely tectonic and important geopolitically too. But the stories there, the stories of the Ukrainians, the stories of what's happening are, you know, are really intense and interesting and amazing to witness. But it is unbelievably important that I come home and walk along the coast and just look at the sea and breathe and make soup and say hello to my neighbors and have this very quiet decompression. That's been an extraordinary thing to come back to. Very different, but very important to have the balance. It's a bit, you know, it's a bit like reporting and novel writing. You know, one is sort of very, you know, reporting, you're talking to people all the time, you're listening all the time, you're trying to tell someone else's story. And novel writing, you just get to kind of kick the wall down and freely roam through your own imagination and your own thoughts. And I like the yin and yang of that too. One informs the other.
Well, I want to talk. I know it. You know, I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to talk about the shift that you made from writing nonfiction, writing journalism, to writing your first novel. And in my research, I learned that you were supposed to appear with Anthony Bourdain, I believe, on his show or on one of his shows in Georgia, the country of Georgia. Yeah. And this was when the Charlie Hebdo attack took place in Paris, correct?
It was the Bataclan attacks that were later. I think they were in October. Am I wrong? They were October or November. So Charlie Hebdo, that shooting, I think, was in January 2015. And then later that year were the Bataclan attacks, when a group of militant Islamist gunmen went throughout Paris and opened fire on several restaurants, tried to attack, do you remember the football match in the Stade de France? And then ended up opening fire and taking hostage in the Bataclan Theatre, where there was a concert going on. And there were, you know, over 300 dead. So yeah, I was in Tbilisi, apparently supposed to be Anthony Bourdain's interlocutor on his Georgia episode. And I woke up and I was like, I had that feeling. It doesn't happen very often, but I know, you know, not to ignore it when it does, because once I ignored that feeling and it was awful. And I just knew I was in the wrong place. And I just rang his producer and said, I'm just so sorry, I've got to go. And I got on a plane and was back in Paris that night and reported the next week. Yeah.
But the book project that emerged from that experience, at least to some degree, was not a work of nonfiction. It was Paris Metro, your first novel.
No, so I was supposed to be writing a nonfiction book about Charlie Hebdo. and that attack. And so I had been talking to all sorts of people about terrorism and what had happened and different aspects of that. So the fact that it happened again meant that I sort of professionally wanted to be there for it. But I remember reporting through that week and just being incredibly frustrated with the reporting. It just seemed too small to me, too narrowly defined. And I remember going out to dinner with Ian McEwan, and we were talking about all sorts of things, and of course the attacks, because they just happened, and of course the whole sort of, at that time, the big and grand and complex debate about Islam and Islamism and Islam in the West and all this sort of thing. There's issues that I've been grappling with for years throughout the Middle East and the wars and revolutions and so forth. And I just remember thinking, this was such a, I remember being so impressed with Ian McEwan and so impressed with his erudition and his breadth of intellect, and also the fact that he took us out to dinner in this delightfully delicious, marvelous restaurant. And I just remember thinking, I want to be Ian McEwan. I'm going to write a novel. I'm going to, this seems like, I instead of it was also 2015. It was a time when journalism was, in the gutter. It was impossible to get commissions. I was having to pivot. I was in a slat. I was in a kind of trench of trying to pitch stories. Nobody wanted to send me anywhere. Syria was too dangerous to go to, certainly as a freelancer. And so I was casting around and a bit lost and a bit, furious with trying to report and not getting anywhere, as I felt. And so I thought, sod this. I'm going to write a novel. And I said, all right, I'm going to do this really fast. I'm going to write 10,000 words a week until it's finished, until I've got 100,000 words. Go. Which is insane. Of course, I was a complete, stream of consciousness drivel came out, but I did it. And then I had to rewrite it a lot, obviously.
Wow. And now here you are with the publication of your second novel, Margot, which, as I was saying earlier in the conversation, has this great classic feel. I keep saying it feels like it was written in another time almost. And what it makes me wonder is what you read. I'm curious to know what kinds of books fed you as you set about to write Margot.
I mean, I think we were talking about it before. Yes, I wanted to write, having written my first novel, which was about war reporter and a lot about the Middle East and set against the Bataclan attacks and so forth. It was a kind of expiation of 15 years of my journalistic life. And so I had sort of got that out of my system. And now and turning to this one, it was, it's an interior story. It's a family drama. It's coming of age. It's a sort of fairly classic. I wanted to write a sort of the classic, who does she end up with? Do you know what I mean? The sort of little bit of Jane Austen or A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. That I love that novel. A very kind of classic tale. No bells and whistles. Let's not sort of get postmodern or overthink it or reinvent, the genre or something. Let's just do a good story, well told. And having written the first novel, I had a little bit more confidence and a little bit more understanding. You get better with this stuff. It's a technique. It's like carpentry. Of fitting and joining and piecing together and matching characters and developing and so forth, sanding, and so I wanted it to read like an old-fashioned novel. I wanted it to read like the novels that I grew up with, the mid-century ones, whether it was this sort of writers that nobody reads anymore, like Neville Shute and James Michener and people like that. I mean, I'm a huge fan, obviously, of Graham Greene. That just, you're less aware of the art than you are of just wanting to turn the page. I think that's what I wanted to do. I just wanted to write a good story. Back to basics.
Well, that brings me to the second word. Like, I kept thinking classic. I think some of it has to do with the time period that the story is set in. It brings you back, to maybe a different era in literary history too. But the other word that came to mind as I was reading this novel was engrossing. This is a totally engrossing story. It was a delight to read. I was fully into the world. I was rooting for Margot. I didn't know who she was going to end up with, and I won't spoil it for listeners, but it's a lovely book, and it's a lovely story about being female. It's a story about womanhood, and in particular at a certain point in, I guess, recent history. Definitely a vivid and moving depiction of what it was like to come of age as a woman in the mid-20th century, and in particular the 1960s.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I it's the most personal book I've ever written. It's not about me. It's not about autobiography, but it's not autobiographical at all. But it's interior and tender, and I wanted. It's written in the third person, but it's written from only one point of view. I wanted it to be very much you're inside Margot's head, and at times that's a sort of confusing place to be. But I wanted to sort of to touch the universal with the individual, right? I hope that readers might recognize themselves in her and her tribulations and her hopes and expectations and experiences.
So I always ask my guests before I let them go if they're working on anything else. If there's something in the pipeline, it's perfectly fine if there is not. But do you have a sense of what's next? Do you have like a hope, or do you have a sense of like the next 3 books that you want to do, or anything like that?
I have like lots of books stacked up like airplanes, over JFK. But there is one project that I'm in the middle of right now that is, it's a novel, it's fiction. I know exactly what I'm trying to do. It will be very interesting if I achieve it. But I'm kind of excited. I'm writing that bit where I'm sort of 25,000 words in. So you're kind of beginning to really, really feel it. You're beginning to flow. You're beginning to kind of, have a sense that you know what you're doing. And I don't want it to be too long. I want it to be sort of fairy tale-ish. That's kind of a corny way of saying fairy tale isn't quite right, but no, I'm curious to see if this experiment of me thinking I'm knowing what I'm doing before I started works better than the last 2 times.
Any hints as to what this new one is about?
No, it's too new. It's too unformed.
Sure. And then last question, since you've done so much work in nonfiction and journalism, and now you're working on your 3rd consecutive novel, I'm wondering, are you done? Do you feel like you're done with the nonfiction books?
No.
Will you continue to do?
No, not at all. I think it's just, I think I now feel like some things you want to explain or tell in nonfiction and some in fiction. And I think that it's really fun to be able to choose. And I feel increasingly confident about the fiction. So that's been a long time coming. And so that's exciting. That feels good. That feels more solid under my feet now.
Well, Wendell, I appreciate so much the time talking to me, especially since there's the time difference between here in Los Angeles and you over there in Brittany. And it is in Brittany, right? I have that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, I appreciate the time.
Which means the end.
Do you speak French?
Well, yeah, pretty badly. I have.
Okay.
Moi
aussi.
C'est pas exactement couramment, no. It's a lot better in Brittany than it was when I lived in Paris. The Bretons are very patient with me and correct me gently.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate the time. I will let you go. Congratulations on Margot.
Thank you so much, Brad. It's been great speaking to you. Thank you.